I hid $200 million before the funeral flowers even wilted. Not because I was greedy, not because I hated his wife, but because of the last thing my son whispered to me in that hospital room, a room that smelled like antiseptic and something I can only describe as goodbye. And the moment I tell you what he said, you will never judge me again. Hi, welcome to this beautiful storytelling channel. Thank you so much for watching. If this story moves you the way I believe it will, please hit subscribe right now, and drop a comment telling me what country you are watching from. I read every single one. My name is Nora Whitfield. I am 63 years old. I live in Bellevue, Washington, in a house my late husband built with his own hands. I raised one son in that house. I buried that son from that house. And I made the most controversial decision of my life from the kitchen of that house, before the neighbors had even finished sending condolence casseroles. People called me a monster. They said a grieving mother had turned cold and cruel. They said no decent woman would lock away money that belonged to a pregnant widow who had just lost her husband. But here's what none of them knew. My son did not die peacefully. He died suspicious. Too suddenly. Too conveniently. On a dry road with no traffic and no logical reason for a crash. And the woman who stood beside his hospital bed that night, crying loud enough for the entire floor to hear, was watching the monitors far more than she was watching him. The morning after he died, before I had eaten a single meal or slept a single hour, I picked up the phone and called our family attorney. My hands were trembling so badly I dropped the phone twice. When he answered, I did not say good morning. I did not cry. I said 4 words. Freeze. Everything. Right. Now. Every account. Every investment. Every trust. Every dollar of that $200 million, locked behind legal steel before sunrise. That single phone call started a war that would consume the next several months of my life. A war that would end with a sealed envelope, a DNA report, and a truth so devastating it made me question whether I had ever truly known my own son at all. But before I tell you what that envelope contained, I need to tell you about the boy who built that fortune, and the night he came to my house in the rain, shaking, and made me promise something I will never forget. There are sons who make their mothers proud. And then there was Caleb. From the time he was 8 years old, teachers pulled me aside at parent-teacher conferences and whispered the same thing, almost word for word. Mrs. Whitfield, that boy is going to change the world. They were not wrong. Caleb grew up disciplined in a way that still amazes me. While other teenagers slept in on Saturdays, he was already at his desk. While other young men spent their 20s figuring out who they were, Caleb was already building something that would outlast him. By 37, he had built a cybersecurity company that protected hospitals, banks, and government systems from digital attacks. Investors called him. Journalists requested interviews. Competitors offered him blank checks to walk away. He walked away from none of it. But here is the thing about Caleb that the business magazines never captured. He still called me every single Sunday. Without fail. Without reminders. Whether he was in Tokyo or Texas, my phone rang at 7 p.m., and it was always him. He still shoveled my driveway during winter storms without being asked. He still remembered my birthday with a card, a handwritten card, not a text message. That was who my son was. So when he walked into my living room one spring evening with a woman on his arm and that glow on his face, I wanted to love her instantly. For him. Her name was Vivienne. She was elegant. Soft-spoken. The kind of woman who made eye contact when she spoke and somehow remembered the name of every person she had ever met. She laughed at the right moments. She asked thoughtful questions. She made Caleb look at her like she was the only person in every room they entered together. And for a while, I believed in her. But there was one thing I could not explain. Every single time Caleb left the room, her smile vanished. Instantly. Like someone had clicked off a light switch. Not a gradual fade. Not the natural relaxation of someone unwinding. A full stop. I told myself I was being a protective mother. I told myself I was looking for reasons to doubt her because no woman would ever feel worthy of my son in my eyes. I kept that thought buried for almost 2 years. Until I could not anymore. 3 months from meeting to engagement. 6 months from engagement to marriage. A ceremony so lavish it made the local lifestyle magazines. Everyone said it was romantic. I sat at the head table and felt something else entirely. I felt rushed. Caleb was a man who researched every major decision for months before committing. He studied spreadsheets before buying a car. He interviewed 3 attorneys before choosing one. He did not do anything fast. Except this. I was not invited into the planning. I was told, shown a venue, handed a dress code, and smiled at warmly whenever I tried to ask questions. At the reception, I watched Vivian work the room. And I mean work it. She moved from table to table, not with Caleb, but independently, laughing a little too brightly, leaning a little too close, listening a little too carefully every time someone mentioned numbers, investments, or business partnerships. She was not celebrating a wedding. She was conducting research. I kept that observation to myself. Mothers get accused of jealousy quickly. I was not going to become that story, but the warning signs kept multiplying over the following months. Shopping bags appearing with no mention of where the money came from. Phone calls she took in the car, in the bathroom, in hallways, anywhere Caleb was not. Weekends away that were explained with half sentences and quickly changed subjects. One Tuesday evening in October, my doorbell rang at 8 p.m. It was Caleb. Unannounced. No phone call ahead. Just standing on my porch in the rain with his coat still on, like he had driven over without planning to and now wasn't sure what to say. I made tea. He sat at the kitchen table and stared at the surface for nearly 10 full minutes. I did not rush him. I have been his mother long enough to know when to be quiet. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower than I had ever heard it. Not sad. Scared. The rain was hitting my windows like it wanted to come inside. Caleb had not removed his coat. He had not touched his tea. He just stood in my living room, staring at the floor like a man trying to find the right words for something that had no right words. Then he said it. Mom, if anything ever happens to me, promise me you won't trust her. I laughed. Gently. Because what else do you do when your son says something like that out of nowhere on a Tuesday night? He did not laugh back. His eyes were steady. Clear. Absolutely terrified. He walked toward me slowly, like the distance between us was important. He lowered his voice, even though we were completely alone, and he said it again. Promise me. I felt the floor shift beneath my feet. This was not about a marital argument. This was not fatigue or frustration. This was a man delivering a message he believed might be the most important message of his life. I asked him what he meant. He said he could not explain fully yet. I asked if he was in danger. He looked away. I asked if he wanted to leave the marriage. He shook his head. Then he reached into the inside pocket of his coat and placed something on the coffee table between us. A small black flash drive. Keep this somewhere safe, he said. Not in the house. Somewhere she would never look. If anything happens to me, you open it. You'll understand everything. I picked it up. It was lighter than I expected for something that felt so heavy. Caleb, you're scaring me. Good, he said. You should be scared. I am. He hugged me at the door. Longer than usual. The kind of hug that says something a person cannot bring themselves to say out loud. I hid the drive that night. In a fireproof box inside my gardening shed. Behind bags of soil and old tools. I did not open it. I told myself he was overreacting. That marriages go through dark seasons. That he would call me Sunday and laugh about how dramatic he had been. He never got to make that call. Nobody receives good news at 2:14 in the morning. The phone rang once and I was already awake. As if my body knew before my mind did. The voice was calm, professional, the kind of calm that is trained, not felt. He introduced himself as an officer with the Washington State Patrol. He said there had been an accident involving my son. My knees gave out before he finished the sentence. I sat on the bedroom floor and I listened. They said his car had struck a concrete barrier on a quiet stretch of highway south of the city. They said the road was completely dry. Traffic was nearly non-existent. Visibility was perfect. No rain. No ice. No mechanical failure identified at the scene. In other words, no reason. I drove to the hospital alone. I do not remember the drive. I only remember the parking lot, how bright the lights were, how cold the air was, how strange it felt that the world was still running normally while mine was collapsing. He was surrounded by machines, tubes and wires in every direction, monitors beeping steadily, doctors moving fast and speaking low. Vivienne was already there. She was crying, loudly, the kind of crying that fills a room and demands attention. I stood beside my son and held his hand and I prayed. But something kept pulling my attention away from him. Vivienne was not looking at Caleb the way a wife looks at a dying husband. She was looking at the monitors, then at the doctors, then at the monitors again. And between her sobs, she kept asking the same question. Will he recover enough to sign documents? The first time, I thought I misheard. The second time, a nurse visibly paused. The third time, I understood exactly what kind of woman I was standing next to. At 6:47 in the morning, the monitors flatlined, and my son was gone. I did not cry in the hospital. I stood completely still, because in the deepest part of me, something had shifted from grief into something colder. Something that looked a lot like certainty. Grief is supposed to be the first thing that moves into your home after a funeral. It sets up residence. It takes up space. It changes every room. But grief never got the chance to settle. Because 3 days after we buried my son, Vivienne arrived at my front door. No flowers. No tears. No memory to share. Just a thick manila folder held under her arm like a business proposal. She sat at my dining table, the same table where Caleb used to eat Sunday dinner, and she opened that folder with the calm, practiced movements of someone who had rehearsed this conversation. She explained, in a voice entirely free of emotion, that she needed immediate access to Caleb's estate. Business decisions could not wait. Accounts needed to be operational. Delays, she said, could cost millions. She slid papers across the table toward me. Signature lines highlighted in yellow. I looked at those papers. Then I looked at her. And I thought about the flash drive sitting in a fireproof box behind bags of soil in my gardening shed. I thought about 11 days ago. A rainy Tuesday. A man who would not take his coat off because he already knew he was not staying long. Promise me you won't trust her. I stood up. I told her I needed time. She left. The moment that door closed, I called our family attorney. I did not explain everything. I simply gave the instruction I had been turning over in my mind since the night in that hospital parking lot. Freeze everything. Every account. Every investment. Every trust. $200 million. Locked. He told me there would be consequences. Legal challenges. Family backlash. I told him I understood. Within hours, the phone calls began. Extended family. Business associates. People I had not heard from in years, all of them suddenly very concerned about what I was doing to a grieving widow. Heartless. Cruel. Power-hungry. I let them say it. Because none of those words frightened me as much as the look on Vivienne's face when her attorney called to inform her that the estate had been frozen. She did not cry. She did not shout. She panicked. And people who are simply grieving do not panic about money. I have lived long enough to know that when a battle is going badly, people reach for their strongest weapon. Vivienne reached for hers 2 weeks later. She called a family meeting through her attorney. Neutral ground, a conference room inside a law office downtown. Caleb's business partners. 2 of his cousins. Our family attorney. And me. She walked in last. She sat down slowly, placed both hands gently on her stomach, and looked directly at me. I'm carrying his child. The room went completely silent. I felt the air leave my lungs. A baby meant inheritance rights. A baby meant legal standing in the estate. A baby meant that every legal wall I had built around that money could eventually come down, because an unborn child of Caleb Whitfield would be entitled to every dollar. Everyone in that room turned to look at me, waiting for my reaction. I gave them nothing. I nodded once, said I needed time to process, and I walked out. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with a calendar. I started counting. Caleb had been traveling internationally for a significant stretch of time before his death. A long-term cybersecurity project overseas, months away, returning only for brief visits home that were carefully scheduled around high-level meetings. I tracked every visit, every confirmed date he had been home. Then I counted backward from the pregnancy timeline she had presented in that conference room. And the numbers did not cooperate. Not even close. I sat back in my chair. The kitchen was completely quiet. The clock on the wall ticked steadily. And I felt something cold and absolute settle into my chest. This child, if there was a child, had not been conceived during any window when Caleb was home. Which meant one of two things. Either the dates Vivienne had presented were wrong, or this baby was not my son's. Suspicion does not arrive all at once. It moves in slowly, quietly, like water finding cracks. By this point, I had cracks everywhere. I began going back over everything I had seen in the past 2 years through a different lens. Doctor appointments she had mentioned, always described vaguely, always scheduled at times Caleb was traveling. An ultrasound image she had shown during the family meeting, I had photographed it discreetly with my phone. Later that night, I looked at the date stamp in the corner. The date on that image was from a week before Caleb returned from his final overseas trip. I stared at that photograph for a long time. The next morning, I drove to the hospital listed on her prenatal paperwork. I did not call ahead. I walked in, approached the reception desk calmly, and gave her name. The receptionist typed slowly, frowned slightly, typed again. "I'm sorry, I don't see a patient file under that name. Are you sure you have the right facility?" I thanked her and walked back to my car. I sat in that parking lot for a while. Not crying. Not shocked. Just still. Because some part of me had already known. When you are a mother and you watch someone perform love at your son, when you watch a smile switch off the moment he leaves a room, something deep inside you files that information away. You ignore it. You override it. You tell yourself you are being unfair. But the information stays. And eventually, the world confirms what you already felt. She was not a patient at that hospital. Her prenatal paperwork listed a facility that had no record of her. The ultrasound was dated before it was medically possible given the timeline she had presented. 1 lie I could question. 2 lies I could investigate. 3 lies stacked together meant something deliberate. This pregnancy was a construction. Built carefully. Designed to give her legal standing over $200 million that she had decided, somewhere along the way, already belonged to her. I am a 63-year-old woman from Bellevue, Washington. I grow tomatoes in summer. I host book club on the 3rd Thursday of every month. I have never hired anyone to follow another human being in my life. Until now. His name was Barrett Osei, a quiet, methodical investigator who specialized in financial fraud and identity deception. He came recommended through our family attorney. He asked few questions and took careful notes. Within 72 hours, he had already found things. Hidden debt. Vivienne had accumulated significant personal debt before she ever met Caleb. Debts that disappeared shortly after their marriage, paid from accounts that should not have had access to marital funds that early. Secret accounts. 3 of them, opened under slightly varied versions of her name, at banks in different states. Wire transfers. Small enough to avoid automatic flags. Regular enough to form a clear pattern. The picture that emerged was not of a grieving widow. It was of a woman who had been planning something long before the accident. But it was what Barrett discovered in the 2nd week that I was not prepared for. Another man. A relationship that had started before the wedding. That had continued, carefully, quietly, throughout the marriage. Hotel records. Travel overlaps. Photographs taken from a distance that no reasonable person could misinterpret. Barrett spread everything across my kitchen table one morning. Photographs. Bank records. Travel logs. Phone records. I looked at all of it. And then I opened the flash drive. The one Caleb had pressed into my hand on that rainy Tuesday 11 days before his death. It took me a long time to click through the files. My hands were shaking again, not from fear this time, but from something heavier. He had known. Everything Barrett had uncovered, Caleb had been quietly documenting it himself for months. The accounts. The transfers. The other man. Notes written in my son's own voice, calm and precise, the way he approached every problem. And at the end of the last document, one sentence. If you're reading this, Mom, I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner. I just needed to be sure. I closed the laptop and sat in complete silence for a very long time. Then I called the attorney. I said 5 words. We need a DNA test. The envelope arrived on a gray Tuesday morning. Certified mail. Official seal. The kind of document that does not leave room for interpretation or argument. I sat with it on the kitchen table for nearly 5 minutes. I did not open it immediately. I made a cup of tea first. Sat down. Placed both hands flat on the table. Then I unfolded the paper inside. The language was clinical. Precise. For words that contained more weight than any sentence I have ever read. Probability of paternity, 0%. The child Vivienne had claimed was carrying Caleb Whitfield's legacy. Was not his child. I set the paper down. I looked out the kitchen window at the yard. The tomato plants were coming up. The garden my husband built. The house my son grew up in. The home where he sat at that table and said promise me. Everything became very clear. My son had known she was carrying another man's child. That was what the flash drive confirmed. He had run his own private investigation. He had documented everything. He had been building toward a confrontation that never came, because he died 11 days after handing me that drive. The accident on a dry road with no traffic and no logical reason. The question at the hospital. Will he recover enough to sign documents? The paperwork at my door 3 days after the funeral. The fake pregnancy used to claim inheritance rights over $200 million. Every piece locked into place. With the DNA results in hand, our attorney moved swiftly. The fraudulent inheritance claim collapsed. The hidden accounts were flagged for investigation. Law enforcement, which had already been quietly reviewing the circumstances of the accident, now had additional context. Vivienne did not go quietly. There were accusations. Counterclaims. A media storm that lasted for weeks. I said nothing publicly. I let the documents speak. Because my son spent his final months quietly, carefully, patiently building the truth, and the least I could do was protect it long enough for the world to see it. He trusted me with that drive. He trusted me with that promise. And I kept it. The money stayed frozen until every legal matter was resolved. And when it was released, every dollar went exactly where Caleb had specified in documents he had quietly updated just weeks before his death. Not to Vivienne. Not to a child that was never his. To the charitable foundation he had built in my husband's name. To his employees. To the hospital where he was born. That is who my son was. That is who he will always be. If this story moved you, if it made you feel something real, please share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss a story like this one. And tell me in the comments, what do you think justice looks like at the end of a story like this? Because I believe the truth always finds a way, even when it has to travel through grief to get there.